and welcome to Maker Day. This is the paint and make kit. So what I'm going to do is show you how I painted it. I'm going to try and do it in real time as best as possible. And I'm going to show you using all the things that you've received in your kits. If you were not able to get a kit, you can email us and we will send you a list, but it's very basic stuff. So what you need is an easel. It's optional, but it is very useful. This is a 9x12 canvas that has been very crudely painted in a pale gray, like a mostly white. And the reason I pre-painted it was because the paint is going to stick better to something that already has a layer of paint on it, and it's been thoroughly dried for a couple days. So none of this is wet, so it means that the paint is going to stick to it better, and it also means that the paint is going to dry faster, which is going to be important because we're going to be doing lots of layers and we want them to be as dry as possible. The other thing that you're going to find in your kits are 4 paint brushes like this. Really what you need is one that's sort of like a medium to large size. Just this is going to be what we're going to do most of the background stuff on, and then you're going to need a smaller one to do a little bit more detail work. And then finally I've got sort of 2 different sizes of really small ones with flat edges or like pointed edges, but basically the idea is that these are your detail brushes. Another thing you have in your kit and you will need if you're playing along at home is a palette. So this is just a laminated piece of paper. You could use like a paper plate if you wanted to, although it does kind of tend to absorb weight, or absorb the water, so you have to work quickly. But if you have like an old magazine or something, that might be a good option. The other things in your kits, I'm using an old library card, but what I included in the kit was a little tag without a barcode for the library card. This is not really so much important for the actual painting, but what I recommend you do is wait for your paint to dry on the palette when you're all done, and then you scrape it off with this, and then just put that directly into the garbage and not, letting it go down the drain. And the last thing, other than the paint itself, but the last thing you're going to need is a little scrap of soap. So basically, when you're all done with the painting, I recommend rinsing out your brushes until the water runs clear, and then dragging the wet brush just over this little chunk of soap. And that's what helps keeps the bristles nice and soft, because it is really hard to get all the paint out of there, even if you're trying really hard, but the soap helps the bristles stay nice and soft and helps rinse it out a little bit better. So just that last stage of rinsing out your brush, just run it over that little wad of soap a couple times, and that should help. Okay, so I have my paint here, and what I'm going to do is just turn this to the side a little bit so you can see what we're doing here. I'm going to try and do this in front of the camera as much as possible, but sometimes I might have to sort of turn it away from the camera, or at least hold the paint a little bit closer to me. So I'm going to do a portrait style painting, and this is the actual finished product. So it's kind of like a landscape picture. We've got some sunset in the background and some mountains in the forefront, and then some trees as well. What I like about this one is that it's still entirely up to you how you want to do it. If you want to use different colors, you're more than welcome to do that. If you don't want to do the trees, if you're not as comfortable with that, you might want to do birds. You might want to do a canoe or something, or a boat. It's entirely up to you. This is your project. Make it your own and just have fun with it. The other things I'm going to recommend you have are a rag or some paper towel and a cup with just a little bit of water. We're going to use that a lot. And then, of course, we're working with paint. It's acrylic paint. It does wash pretty easily, especially off skin, but I do recommend that you wear something you don't care too much about, because you might get paint splattered on it. So just keep that in mind. All right, so I'm just going to move my paint a little bit closer. So you have 6 colors, a blue, a purple, and a green, an orange, a white, and a black. And the first color that I'm going to get started with is orange. And what I'm going to keep coming back to over and over again, white paint, lots of it. So you have a larger amount of white paint than you do of orange. There is a reason for that. And if you are following along at home and you didn't get your hands on a kit and you're just using your own supplies, feel free to not use orange. This is sort of a sunset, sunrise kind of thing. I'm using like orange with a little bit of white and then less orange as I move my way up, and then transferring into more blue tones. But you could use pink, you could use purple if you like. It's totally up to you. The orange I have here is a really true bright orange, and then the white is obviously just white. And I'm gonna get going. So I am not an expert painter whatsoever. This is all very basic stuff, so keep that in mind. And first thing, I'm gonna get my brush a little bit wet, and I'm just gonna get going. So I'm gonna mix tilt that down a little bit. I know it's hard to see with the light in here, but I'm gonna get a healthy amount of white on my brush, and then I'm gonna add some orange. And I am gonna go quite heavy on the orange. And another thing to keep in mind, if you're doing a couple kits, you might want to sign the back of your work. And you're going to want to cover the entire canvas. You're not going to want to have any white space or blank space. And you are going to want to go over on the edges. So I've gone a little bit over the edges here, but nothing too intense. But eventually you are going to want to cover all the sides, especially if this is something that you're going to hang somewhere. Trust me, it'll just be annoying if you hang it on a shelf and then you see a weird line of crudely painted canvas. So make sure that when you're doing it, you are taking the opportunity to paint the edges and the bottom and the top. And another thing, last thing before I start, keep in mind that your paint is going to dry darker. So it might look really whitewashed, and that's totally fine. You might not want yours to be super saturated anyway, but just keep in mind that the paint is going to dry darker. So I'm going to kind of split this into thirds in my head, and I'm going to paint roughly the top 2/3 my horizon colors, and I'm not going to worry too much at all about the bottom third, but I do want this darkest orange part to be about 2/3 of the way down. And because this is the first layer of paint that's going on, you are going to want to wet your brush every time that it just feels like it's starting to pull across the paint. That's going to help you get a better blend line, and it's also going to have you using less paint, which is in turn going to make it dry faster. And like I said, I'm going over the edges before I forget, because this is sort of the deepest orange color I'm going to get. And I'm just alternating between my paint and my water. And now that I've got sort of the darkest bit of orange on the bottom, I'm going to start mixing in more white and work my way up the canvas. And every time you're going over a new part of canvas, you're going to need to wet that brush again, because the dry canvas really does pull the moisture out. And it doesn't have to be perfect. But this is a good technique to practice, getting stuff sort of as blended as possible. And the farther up the canvas you're going, the more white you're including in your paint. but you do still want just the slightest bit of orange, even though it's obviously looking a little bit pink here. That's okay. And the blending in of shades is something that you're going to want to get comfortable with, because it's sort of part of many painting projects, whether you're a beginner or a little more intermediate or advanced. Okay, and this is going to feel a little bit wrong. I'm going to rinse my brush a little bit, but I do want a hint of that orange still on my brush. And the reason for that is because I'm going to start blending it into the blues now, but I don't want it to just look like I went from orange to blue without any, of course, I've got hair on the canvas here. You want to include sort of because this is sort of a sunset, you want to make sure that you are including what you were using into what you are using, because otherwise it's just going to look too different. So I'm going to add some blue to my canvas here, my palette. And again, I've got just a hint of the orange still on my brush. And now I'm going to start mixing in some blue and white. I've got way too much blue there, so I'm going to go here and pulling in just that little bit of orange that's left on the brush and is on your canvas there, your palette there. And I'm going to start just a little bit above the orange line, because I know I've already got a lot more blue than I want. And making sure to get those edges whenever you think of it. Okay, so I've got my blue with a bunch of white. And then as I blend it back in, I'm going to go back and grab more white and just the tiniest little bit of orange, put that back in my white and blue. And the result is something that looks a little bit grayish, but that is okay. So you can barely tell, but this color right here has blue, orange, and white. And now I'm just going to rinse off my brush a little bit better. And I'm going to go mostly white. But I'm going to mix it over top of where I was mixing my blue with that hint of orange, so that I'm getting a real white with just a touch of orange and blue, so it looks quite gray on the palette. Okay, and then as I'm going up the canvas, including more of the blue. And as I go down, just a hint of that orange mixed with more white. Okay, now I'm going to grab a little bit more white. And just so you know, all the paints that we bought, all of the canvases we bought, all the easels and the paintbrushes, everything was bought sort of at dollar stores, local craft stores. So if you do want to do this again, maybe you do it once, you don't like your result, you can go back pretty easily and get something that you are happy with. It's all relatively expensive supplies. And again, remember, this is entirely your own work. You are not limited to what we've given you here. You might not want to even do the sunset drawing. You might find that you want to do it all blues. Maybe you want to do it blues and purples so that it's more of like a twilight coloring. There are lots of options where you can sort of change things up with this one. And you also don't have to do it straight across. You could do more of an arc so that it's darker in the corners and then lightens up in the middle. Totally up to you. Okay, so I'm pretty okay with that, the result of that. I've got 2/3 of my canvas painted. I'm cleaning up my brush a little bit more thoroughly. I'm gonna dry it off a bit because my next step is going to be getting a deeper blue on the top here for just that last little corner of the canvas. And I'm gonna start with sort of just blue, no white on my brush right now. And I'm gonna get the very top of this. I'm gonna make sure I get the very top of it with this blue. This is sort of the darkest point. And now I'm going to start working white into that. So we were working more saturated, adding more white, more white, more white. And now that I'm at the top, I'm going saturated and I'm working white sort of in the opposite direction. If you've never blended anything before, it's scary. If this is sort of your first painting exercise in a long time or ever, don't worry about it. It doesn't have to be perfect. It's more about having fun. Now, I've tried to sort of get mine as even as possible, but if you want, you could do a more streaky look if you wanted to add clouds or something like that. You can definitely do whatever you think whatever you think looks best. Okay, I'm going to clean off my brush. Okay, so the last thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take like a single drop of black paint and I'm going to add that to the blue, like just the smallest amount, because I want the very top to be even darker than this. And that's because I'm gonna end up using black in with the mountainscapes that I'm doing. So I do want to sort of reflect a darker color in the sky, because I know that's what I'm going to end up with down here, and I want it to look just a little bit combined. The other option, and I might do that as well, is to add a little bit of purple, because it's a very dark purple. It mixes pretty well with the blue and sort of gives a darker, more midnighty color to it. Okay, so I actually like that better, mixing a dollop of purple in with the blue. I like the way that looks better than when I mix the black. And I'm not gonna worry too much about having it even. I am gonna do a little bit of this arc at the top. So I've got more dark of this purpley blue up here. Okay, and then back to my regular blue. And adding more white. One of the habits I run into with blending is that it doesn't look perfect. It doesn't look perfectly blended. And then I go over it and over it and over it when I should have just left it alone. So that's what I'm gonna try and practice some restraint here. And just leave it alone as best as I can once I get some white mixed in here. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to let this sit for about 10 minutes. It shouldn't take too long. You might notice that the first bit that you painted is already dry. So I'm just going to pause the video for a bit and give this some time to dry. Okay, welcome back. We are here after about roughly 10 minutes of letting everything dry. The top is not going to be perfectly dry, nor is the middle, because I was just working on it. But the part that I need to start painting over is dry. So that's what my main concern was. Okay, so what I'm going to start to do next, and I will mention that in this one, it's a little bit hard to see. Sorry, it's so bright in this room. I've speckled some white paint. The idea being that it can either look like stars or snow. It is totally up to you if you want to do that part. If you do and you don't want those flecks getting over your mountaintops, I would recommend doing it now. And I would recommend focusing it on the top here, because that's where you're going to get the most contrast between the white and the darkest blue up here. So the way I did that was I took a brush and I dipped it directly into white paint. I used a smaller brush like one of these, and I dipped it into a little bit of white paint, and I used no water, so just a dry brush. And I just kind of flick it a couple times around the top there. You can use wet. I just found that the wetter the paint was, the more it would leave lines, which I didn't like, and I would end up having to try and sort of brush them off the paint. But that is an option you can do just for the sake of time. I'm not going to do it today, but again, it's totally up to you. You might even want to do like a moon. That would be really nice, or a sun if you wanted. You might want to make it more winter-like and do big snowy pockets of white paint everywhere. Again, it's totally up to you. Just for the sake of time today, I'm not going to do that. But that dry brush and the flicking really close to the canvas is what I did. Just beware, if you're going to do that, paint gets everywhere. So whatever you've got behind you, make sure you've got a drop cloth or something down to prevent that from getting all messy. Okay, so what we're going to work on now is the mountains. So I'm going to work from the lightest color to the darkest color. So I'm going to start with my blue mixed with some white, and then for this middle guy here, just straight blue, and then I'm going to start mixing in some purple to get this mid-tone, and then finally I'm going to use mixes of blue and purple and black to get this darkest guy here. Of course, this is entirely up to you. You can have green mountains, you can have black mountains, you can do whatever you like. You could put snow caps on top of them if you wanted it to look kind of like the Rockies. Entirely up to you. And for this, I am switching over to my medium brush. So this was the medium large one that I used to do the bulk of the blending. And now I'm going to this guy who is substantially smaller. Okay, so I'm gonna grab a bunch of blue and mix that with the white I've got here. And I always get very nervous about putting that first layer of paint on for mountains, but really it's nothing you need to think too hard about. It's just fun. I'm not a painter, so I'm not expecting it to be perfect by any means. Okay, and I'm gonna pick a point maybe, I don't know, 2 inches off the very, maybe 3 inches off the bottom here, and I'm just gonna go for it. I'm just gonna act like there is another mountain just behind there, and I'm gonna paint that side blue. See, I haven't done a very good job. This is the side that is very far away from the camera, so it's very messy. That would be the side that I will never want to see again, so I'll put it on a wall where I'm never going to look at that side of the canvas. But you guys hopefully are doing a much better job than I am. And I'm not going to worry too much about what it looks like at the bottom, but I do want to make sure that I'm covering all of that orange paint with my blue and white mixture. So that is going to be sort of a thicker layer of paint. And I'm going to pull it downwards onto that bottom third. but because I've got like a water feature, for lack of a better term, at the very bottom, I'm not going to think too much about it, but it is going to help me in the long run to pull some of this blue color down. And because these are sort of saturated tones, I do want to make sure that I have a clean edge on the bottom there. And by that I mean I don't want like a wispy bit of blue that isn't quite covering all of the orange there. I want to make sure that everywhere that is over that orange is completely covering it, because mountains aren't see-through, as far as I've been taught. Okay, so that's sort of my first mountain peak. Now I'm going to move over to one in the middle, and that is going to be just blue. So no white, just blue. It's going to be a little bit darker than this one, and that's sort of going to give me the illusion that this one is closer. And I want to try and remember as best I can that I don't want to have them the same height. I want everything to be a different height. And that isn't going to necessarily mean that this is the tallest, because I think I actually want this one a bit shorter. Give him a little buddy right next there. And again, just making sure I'm covering everything. Covering all that orange entirely. And because the darker things are closer to you, you want to make sure that you're going over in the darker color over that last blue with the white. And again, pulling that blue down, but not worrying too much about it looking perfect. Just enough to cover the white or the orange. Okay, so I've got my blue and white mountains, and I've got my straight blue mountains, and I'm gonna move over and I'm gonna do sort of like a blue and purple. And I'm running out of space on my palette here. I gotta pay attention to that a little bit more. And I would say color-wise, I'm going about 50-50 with the purple and the blue here, because my next mountain is going to be purple and blue and black. Okay, so now I want a guy that's taller. Maybe he's about that tall. Okay. And I would even say that this is not quite as dark as I want it, so I'm going to add more purple, and I'm going to add like a drop of black. That's darker. That's better. Now for my taste, this is too triangular. And I'd rather it be a funny shape than too symmetrical, so I'm gonna give him some bumps and ridges here. And in case you're wondering, the reason I'm pulling it down is because for this water feature, you do want some of your color from the mountains in your water, the reflection of the water. But the problem is, once you've, I've just been adding darker colors to my paintbrush every time here. And once you add that, you can't really go back and say, okay, now I want this purple that I use, this purple black. It's harder to get, but you want it a little bit of that tone in the water. So it's just easier if you sort of make a point to pull it down while you're still making that mountain. I'm not going to worry too much about the side of this because most of this guy is going to be covered in my darkest color. Okay, so now I'm going to turn my palette so I've got a lot more room because I'm entirely out of room here. And I'm going to go blue, and I'm going to add a bunch of purple, get that nice and dark, and I'm going to add black. So black is very unforgiving, so keep that in mind. Just want to make sure I'm using up all my purple and blue before I add the black, covering any little flecks of orange or gray that you see coming through. Okay, so as I was saying, black is unforgiving, so you want to use it a little bit at a time because once you add it, you can't unadd it. And it does come out looking like a muddy gray, like a dark slate gray. But because we mixed it ourselves, we know it's got hues of the purple and the blue in it. So the idea is it should all match. Okay, and I'm going to go quite a ways up with this guy. And because I can now see that it's too similar, I'm going to add more black. Too close to that color we were working with before. I'm going to do a little second peak there. Paint is drying up a bit, so I'm adding water as I go so that I've still got that darkest color here. Another good technique for blending is to do like an X pattern. Not only does that help clear off your brush, it helps get more paint onto the canvas and blend in stuff that looks sort of like it's got lines running through it. That's something to keep in mind. Now I'm just picking up paint from where I was working on it. A little bit of everything on the brush to get me that watery vibe. the edges. Oh, getting too much white in this section. Okay, so the bottom obviously is a big mess. That's okay, and I am going to move my brush all the way around, even though I've got almost no water left on it, because I just want a base layer there that's sort of pulling in all of these colors. Give it a little bit wet here. Okay. And as you add water and sort of go over everything, you're obviously going to be able to sort of plot where your water line is going to be, which is important because if nothing else, you want that part of your painting to be straight and flat. I'm just going to get this bottom bit here. I hope you guys are doing a better job of painting the bottom than I am, even though I warned against it. To remember to do it, I've obviously forgotten. Okay. So it's not perfect, but it is sort of the general shape of the mountains that we wanted, that I wanted. Okay, I'm going to clean off my brush. Now the next step is a little bit important that you do it while this bottom bit is wet. So I'm going to clean off my brush just to have it ready, because there is going to be a bit of a blending blitz coming up. So what I'm going to do, and it's weird, is I'm going to take the library card that I got. If you have a paint palette, this is a great opportunity to use it. I don't have one here, so I'm just going to use the edge of this library card, and I'm going to drag it through some white paint and as evenly as I can, almost like I'm swiping it through like a credit card machine. Okay. This is a bit nerve-wracking, but it's the worst part. So I'm going to pick a point on the canvas where I've mixed and my mountains aren't looking too nice. So this is the part where I've mixed all the darker colors and the blues over here, knowing that I'm gonna have a water line. So this is what you're making now. You're making a water line, and you want it to be as straight as possible. And I'm gonna pick a spot about here. And I'm just going to run this card full of white paint. And it's a little bit hard because the canvas in the middle is wet from your paint and the water on your brush. So that means it's sinking a bit. And of course, because you're doing a water line, you kind of have to commit to it once you've got it on there. There's no going backsies. So keep that in mind. I probably went a little bit higher than I meant to, but because I've already put that white paint on the canvas, there's no going back. And if you remember, round it over the edges as well. Okay, so I've still got a little bit of the white paint on my card here. I'm going to add a little bit more, but not too much, because I want it to be mostly dry. Another nerve-wracking part, I'm going to pull it down just a little bit. So again, don't worry too much. This isn't going to look perfect, especially if you're a beginner, but that's the general idea. You've got a white line of paint. You've got your mostly clean brush with a little bit of water. And now you're just going to blend that. So that's going to make the white paint less streaky. It's also going to bring more white, which is something that I want, into the bottom of this. And it's going to help give that sort of reflection-y look of water into the bottom there. Okay. And because you've got that undertone of all of the colors that we pulled down into this section, now you're going to use that to your advantage and blend everything in so it kind of looks like just a murky water. And feel free to get your brush nice and wet to do that. Okay, now I'm going to take the very bottom of my canvas and I'm going to get my brush reasonably wet with a lot of white paint and sort of a touch of the blue, but I am looking for mostly white here on a wet brush. And I'm just going to clean up the edges here a little bit. And then mostly on this side, I'm going to add just like the tiniest little touch of black and purple there, just so that it's a little bit darker on that side. And I think I've got too much paint on my brush because I just wanted this to be very light. And I've got too much paint, so I'm just going to take off most of the paint. Now my brush is mostly just wet with water. And I'm just going to go over that and do my best to blend it. So this bottom of the canvas is a real mess because it's got sort of all of the colors and a lot of water. You are going to want to let that dry as much as possible. It makes for a really murky gray water, which is what I was going for. But you might not want yours to be like that, so keep that in mind. You might want it to be a lot more blue or a lot more sort of linear with the bottoms of the mountains here. You might want it to be like white and blue here and black and purple here, totally up to you. Okay, and I'm going to pause it again because I'm going to start my next and sort of final stage is going to be putting in some trees. So I want it to be as dry as possible because I'm going to be fiddling around with this water line here and I want that to be dry. So I'm going to pause the recording here, take about a 10-minute break, and I'll be back when that section is dry. Okay, welcome back. We are sort of doing our last installment of this painting. So the final step is going to be the trees that I'm going to do. And I'm going to do them right in front of my lightest color here, sort of give it a balance so it's not super dark on this side, super light on this side. I'm going to take the brush that I have, and I've got two smaller ones here, but I'm going to use the ones that have the smallest and kind of flattest edges. So this one has a bit of an angular edge and this one's got a completely flat edge, and they're both pretty narrow at the tip, which is what I want in terms of detail work. So the green that you have in your kits or that I've got here is quite a bright green. And what I actually want for the trees is a darker, more like hunter green. So I'm going to use my sort of angled edge here. I should know the names of these paintbrushes, but I absolutely don't. And I'm going to get it just a little bit wet. And I'm going to be mixing this really bright green with some black. And again, black a little bit goes a long way. I'm just going to mix that with my green. I actually need another fresh drop of black anyway. And what I'm going to do is use my green and black, and honestly, it's mostly black, so it's a really dark green. And I'm going to put that just on the tip of my brush. So I've kind of wiped all the excess paint off my brush because this is a really detailed part. And I'm going to draw some tree lines, and they're going to be different sizes. And then what I'm going to go and do is sort of create the branches. So these are, you know, I would describe them as evergreen-ish trees. It's a painting, so I'm not going to worry too much about making it true to life. But that's what I am going for now. I'm just going to do a cluster of trees. And this is a good way in your painting to hide any mistakes. If your paint is completely dry here, I might even recommend putting a bit of tape along the water line, because that is a danger that you're going to sort of go over here with a really dark color and mess up your nice water line there. So I'm just going to draw some tree trunks sort of as close to that water line as I can comfortably get, with this really dark green with black. And I'm going to make it look like a cluster of trees, because that sort of takes the stress off the detail of it. If you make it look like a clump of 100 trees that are just all blended together, you don't need to worry so much. Okay, and I'm going to start just working some details here. And towards the bottom, I'm going to go and sort of blend in that shape a little bit more. And I'm not going to worry too much about the tops, because I think I'm actually going to use my other brush that is completely flat on top to do the tops of the trees there. So with this angled brush and that super dark paint, I'm just going to sort of change my direction a little bit and make sure I'm getting what looks like clumps of trees at the bottom here. You don't need to use like a ton of paint for this, but you do of course, want to make sure that you're covering as much of these tree branches as you would sort of roughly see in nature. Of course, trees are all different, so you don't have to worry too much about what they look like. My brush is like mostly dry, so I'm just gonna kind of run it along that water line and then up so that it really does look like a dense concentration of foliage from that water line. And sort of more dense at the bottom and a little more sparse on top because the trees are all different heights. But towards the ground there, I want sort of to give the illusion that it's all nice and full. Again, if you don't want to do trees, you certainly don't have to. If you want to do a different kind of tree, by all means, go for it. This is sort of the easiest one style of tree that as a very amateur painter I can do. Okay, so now I'm going to change to my flat brush here, get it just the tiniest bit of water and that dark blacky green color without too much excess, and just working sort of with the tip here, give my taller trees some detail. If you don't want trees, I would recommend sort of doing something in there so it's not just mountains, water, sky. Birds, boats, canoes, maybe it's more of a ice rink. If you want to put little people and cute little skates, go bananas. Whatever you think you want, just go for it. This is just fun. But it is sort of nice to have more than just the very basic landscape. And I like trees because trees are obviously very open to interpretation. There are so many different kinds of trees and they all look so different. So I never get too concerned about making them look too perfect. If you were really ambitious, you could maybe do like a little house or a cottage or a chalet kind of vibe, or a dock and a cottage. Make this tree very wide, that's okay. Okay, so another thing that I'm going to do now that is kind of a trick with trees. So what I've got here is a very basic tree outline looking shrub area. And it's in really dark green because it mixed in all that black. What I'm going to do now is use a little bit less black in the green. And that's going to give it some dimension because obviously this clump of trees, some are going to be closer to you, some are going to be farther away. So by adding a different shade kind of right on top, it's going to look a little bit more realistic. So I still have some green or some black in this color, but certainly much less. And I'm not going to do a ton of up and down, and I'm not going to mix it in a bit. I want this lighter green to sort of sit on top of that dark color. And it's gonna look a little weird when it's wet, but I find when it dries, it looks pretty nice. You don't want to go too crazy. But it is sort of a good opportunity to cover up any mistakes you may have made. I've definitely made some errors here, but that's okay. And this is the same technique that I would use, sort of going for a more fuller, darker color, and then on top, I've done the same thing in different paintings with snow. So, you know, you draw a green tree or a green and brown tree, whatever, and then I sort of take a flat brush and I go over it with white, like straight white. And that ends up looking pretty nice because snow sort of just sits on top. So it looks real, it dries nicely, gives your painting some dimension. And another fully green tree just on the edge here. And you can even do another layer. So I've got the dark green on the bottom, and I've got a green with just a touch of black. But you know, you could, in fact, I might even do that. I'm gonna add a couple spots of bright green and hope that I don't mess anything up. Yeah, just giving me something. Okay, so now I'm going just green, nothing else. I'm gonna use it sparingly, so not a ton on my brush here, and just kind of fleck that throughout. And with this bright green, this green on its own with no black mixed in, I'm going to use it even more sparingly. And I'm not going to worry about getting every sort of tree with it. Just sort of each iteration of green less and less. Okay, so the final thing I'm going to do, just to neaten things up a bit, is I'm going to take this flat brush, and I'm just going to go over my waterline a bit because I have sort of muddied it a bit, just going over stuff. So I'm not going to use the cardigan, although I still do prefer that technique for getting sort of the straightest line. But now I'm just going to take that flat brush with the bright white with nothing else in it, no colors mixed in, and go, yeah, there's a hair on my brush. Go as lightly as I can. Covering up any mistakes I made on the first round, of which there are plenty. And just neaten it up. And if you have some confidence, you can do this with a thicker layer of paint. I'm just gonna tempt fate and do some more pull down strokes here. I will be going over. And acrylic paint does dry fast, which is nice. And I'm going to put an extra bit of white here and make sure that my brush is wet, because I've got all that blue in that water line. But I'm going to add a little bit of that mid green, the stuff that's got a little bit of black in it. And I'm just going to pull that through in with the white. And now I'm just going to blend everything together as if it were real water, so that I'm getting a little bit of a reflection of each sort of component in the painting here. So I've got my water line, sort of like a murky green under the trees, and it turns into more of a blue under the mountains. And the water part is kind of where the dryness of your brush is sort of the most important. You don't want it to be too murky, but you do want to give some dimension to the water. It doesn't have to be perfect. I'm going to add a touch of white to my brush here. Too much white, too much white. Darker color here, more or less. Okay. I'm doing that thing where I've now done too much. So I'm just going to get my brush sort of empty of most of the paint with a medium amount of water on it, and go over that section again that I kind of messed up. And that's just to make the water line a little less murky looking. Okay guys, there you have it. That's it. So you've got your sunset, sunrise, sky here. You've got several mountains in the background, and then you've got some trees in the foreground with a nice water line going across. But please take the opportunity to make this painting however you like. Sorry, I've got a pen under my computer. Totally open to interpretation. You can add stars, you can add snow, you can knock out the trees, you can do whatever you like. The point is just to have fun. And again, to use your scraper. So I've got a filthy palette here. So what I'm going to do is wait for all the paint to dry, and then I'm going to take my library card or paint scraper, if you've got one, and just peel all the paint off it when it's all dry and put it right into the garbage, and then rinse off the palette. That is one of the things we're asking to be returned. And then for the brushes, same idea. I'm going to rinse them as best as I can in warm water. And then when I'm done that, I'm going to take that little chunk of soap and I'm going to run the brushes through that so that helps keep the bristles nice and clean and soft. And that's it. So whenever you're done with your canvas, or sorry, whenever you're done with your painting, please return the bags, the easels, the palettes, and the paintbrushes. And I think that's it. So I hope you enjoyed this craft. We have lots more Maker Days coming up. And obviously everything looks a little bit different. So I hope that you have something that looks even more different and lovely, and that you're happy with your painting.